Hello everybody, I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes. Welcome to my series Mom's Favorites, Books My Mother Loved. And this week we have hit book 4 of the Palliser Novels, which is entitled Phineas Redux. Some of you, possibly, might remember that there was a book called Phineas Finn, which was book 2 of the series. Phineas Redux is what happens when apparently, and I do not have this by my own research, I have this by information granted to me by people who are not me, that apparently what happened was Anthony Trollope wrote Phineas Finn, and he finished his book with Phineas making a stand on moral grounds that there was a particular that he had gotten into government, and there was a particular measure that he felt he could not support, and so, after much soul-searching, because he was being paid a very, very good wage to work for the government, to be part of the then-ruling party, and, you know, there were a lot of reasons to not buck his party line, but the fact was that he felt he could not in good conscience follow the party line. He was against the measure that they were putting forward. And, well, not precisely against it, but against the fact that they were ignoring this thing that he felt needed to be done. And so he resigned. And as a consequence of that, at the end of that book, he was granted a really quite good wage. It was about half of what he had been making working for the government, but it's still very, very good. It is more than twice what his father had been giving him when he first started out in London, that his father had been paying him a certain number of pounds monthly, and this was more than twice what his father had been giving him and expecting to live off of, so one can assume that the amount was solid. And he went home to Ireland, and he married a young woman who he had sort of promised something to at the start of the book, and after much waffling and going back and forth and falling in love with 2 different women and half in love with a third, he wound up going home to Sweet Mary, and they were set to be married, and he has a pretty decent job, and he had stood by his personal morals and ethics. And apparently, following this, Anthony Trollope got hit by a massive letter campaign from people who were really upset how that book had ended. They felt he had done poor Phineas ill, somehow, and they wanted him to fix it. So he writes Phineas Redux. And Phineas Redux is Phineas going through just everything bad happens to Phineas in this book. Like, the book starts, and his wife has died. And then he goes back to London because they have asked him back because they're hoping to have him back as a member of Parliament. And, you know, like, he goes to the voters in this particular district where they're hoping that he'll get elected. And, you know, and he goes up there and he starts giving fiery speeches in alignment with what the people there want, which has to do with a severance of church and state. At this particular point in time in history, after all, there wasn't a separation of church and state. There was the state church, the Church of England. The Church of England being that church that nominally the monarch of England is the head of. Those of you who know history, those of you who don't know history may be intrigued to discover that what happened was that at one point King Henry VIII had decided that he wanted to divorce his wife. And the Pope, because in order to get a divorce in the Catholic Church, which was what most people, which was what they were at the time, over in England, that you had to apply to the Pope to grant you a divorce, and the Pope isn't just going to grant you a divorce because, well, I don't feel like being married to her anymore. And when the Pope said no, King Henry VIII said, fine, then I'm going to make my own church. And he did. And it was basically the Catholic Church, except instead of a pope, it has a ruling monarch, meaning at this particular moment in time, the head of the English Church is nominally Queen Elizabeth II. There's a lot more stuff. There are some other more complicated things to do with it, but roughly his idea was, if I make a church that I am the head of, then whenever I want to get divorced, I can give myself a dispensation to be divorced, because I will be the head of my own church. And so he did, but it made the church the state church. There wasn't a separation of church and state, because, well, if the King of England is the head of the church, then the church is the state church. And so measures are being suggested to basically say, we're taking the church out of the state, and the state is going to stop paying for the church, because right now the church is being paid for by your taxes, or, well, by the taxes of the people of England at the time of writing this book in the place and time that it's set in, which, is kind of a problem. And if you're progressive enough to want a separation of church and state, then you're going to want to have that severance. Anyway, so Phineas stood up and he's speaking on behalf of it, and then when he winds up eventually being elected after a whole thing that proved fraud on the part of his competitor, which doesn't mean anything because everybody was bribing people to vote for them at the time, at least within this particular book, and so it didn't really mean anything. But Phineas gets his seat, and then immediately the other side, the opposing party, brings up a measure for exactly what Phineas had been campaigning for, but the problem is that they can't, on principle, support what the opposition is doing because they're the opposition, which meant that a whole bunch of people who were in favor of this severance then had to find a way to say, we're in favor of severance, we just don't want you guys doing it. And so that was what they did, but it meant that Phineas had to sort of go up there and, say this thing, and, and throughout this book, over and over again, he can't get elected. Please ignore the pop-up on the screen if you can see it. Point is, and see, there's the picture of his dead wife's gravestone. Anyways, so he's got that, and it's really, really sad. Anyways, by the end of the book, he has been accused of murdering a man that Mr. Bonteen had been saying not very nice things about Phineas, and Phineas had gotten his back up about it, and was hot-blooded enough to take serious umbrage at what was being said, in spite of everybody's advice to him to just let it roll off. It's not important. People who actually matter won't believe him, but Phineas just, he doesn't have much of an income. What he has is he's living off of his savings, because being in government doesn't pay unless you manage to get a sort of an undersecretary post in cabinet or whatever, which he doesn't have. And his luck just keeps on going worse and worse, and he spends weeks and weeks, being kept jailed and being afraid that he might actually lose his case and be hung for murder. Eventually, he is found not guilty, and he gets out and is really, really upset and broken and just can't even deal with it, because of course he knew he was innocent, and it felt really ridiculous to him that anyone would think he was innocent, but a whole bunch of people had not so much, said, oh, we believe you're innocent, as, well, we don't want to believe that you do it. And he's just really, really not having a good time of it. And this book only really resolves in his favor in like the last 2 chapters, when he proposes to this woman who had gone to, that she had effectively proposed to him at near the end of the first book, Madame Goesler, little realizing that he had already become engaged to be married to his Irish girl. But she had proposed to him on the basis of, well, we can make it a business arrangement. We'll get married, and I'm rich, so you'd have an income that would mean you could stay in government. And he's sorely tempted by it, but he's a man of his word, and he had promised to marry Mary, and so he did. But after everything, he winds up becoming engaged to and marrying Madame Goesler at the end of this book, and yeah, it's kind of the last 2 chapters that it resolves all right. The rest of the book is just, it's sad. Everything that happens to him is sad. Being arrested for a murder that he didn't commit, but everybody thinks he did because he was muttering about how he wished he could, smack the man around for being insulting. And also throughout all of this book, Lady Laura, who he had fallen in love with early on in the first book and had proposed to, and she had turned him down because she wanted to marry Robert Kennedy. And she had married Mr. Kennedy, and then Mr. Kennedy had turned out to be hyper-religious and obsessive about it, and he was a man with no subtleties that she would say things like, oh, I have a headache, and he would immediately call a doctor. And the problem is that having a headache is code for, could you leave me alone for the rest of the day? I just don't want to deal with anything. And he never understood the code. He would just take her at her word. Oh, you have a headache. I had better call it. If you have a headache that's serious enough for you to want to retire to your room, clearly we should get a doctor. And she'd be like, I don't want a doctor. I just want you to leave me alone for a minute. But, on top of which also he was, like I said, hyper-religious, so on Sundays he would intend to keep the Sabbath day and keep it holy, and that meant not seeing anybody or talking to anybody or having any socialization, which, because she was highly political before and had married him on the understanding and thought that she would be able to work on politics through her husband, and when her husband turned out to be somebody who doesn't want to talk about politics, I want you to do my accounts and then sit quietly with me and read Bible verses all Sunday, and she just lost it. Anyways, she winds up running away from her husband, and he doesn't understand, because the problem is that he doesn't see what he's doing that makes her life so intolerable, and because he fundamentally cannot see how it's intolerable to her, she never explains, because he would never understand this, because among other things, when she said, we're making each other miserable, when Phineas tells him you made each other miserable, he said, marriage isn't about being happy. I shouldn't be happy. Nobody on earth should be happy. Nor we can be happy when we're dead. And, it's kind of awful to be married to somebody like that unless you're also like that. So Laura is obsessed with Phineas and tries to convince herself that she's not in love with him when she totally is, and then throughout this book spends the entire time flinging herself around, and it's really distressing to read, because she just emotionally flails about how she wants to help him, and isn't he innocent, and I have to do something, and asking her brother to please just hand my entire fortune over to this man with whom I have absolutely no legitimate relationship, and everybody's constantly saying, Laura, you need to dial it back. Laura, you need to stop. But she doesn't, because she's in love with him and is regretting that she married Kennedy. She can't, because she can't help it, because she's so regretful she didn't marry for love instead of for potential political influence that she then never got. Anyways, so that's kind of what I have to say about this book. It is a drag, this book. So that's everything, and I will see you all next week.